This is a production of Cornell University.
Anyhow, so I'm really happy to be here today. It's really nice to see you all. As Carlin mentioned, I retired at the end of January. I've sort of been rooting around my house for the month of February and trying to figure out what to do next. And that's still a work in progress. But I wanted to talk, and I also note that I'm the third retiree or soon to be retiree to give a talk this semester. So it seems like it's a trend. I don't know, next year we might have what, 5 or 6 or anyhow, it just does underline to me that we're in this time of transition. So, so I wanted to talk about, my view of extension, and instead of going through a blow by blow of my retrospective of my career, just talk about different models that people use for extension and how is it that growers adopt practices? What are the impacts that we make? So in the interest of full disclosure, I want to say that this is a rerun. And I gave this almost this exact talk about 5 years ago up at AgriTech. And so it was great to have that skeleton here for my talk today. So I just want to start out a little bit with my history. And I came to Cornell in 1985 to be an entomology graduate student. I just come off the Peace Corps in Honduras and was eager to continue my education. I worked with Jan Nyrup as my advisor, and then finally they let me have a PhD, and I got to shake hands with Frank Rhodes, the president of Cornell at that time. Following that, I spent 5 years working in grape entomology. A lot of that time I was working on this one insect, the eastern grape leafhopper. I got to know that sucker well in 5 years. But by the end of that, it sort of felt kind of narrow. So it was a disciplinary focus, and it was just on grape insects. So when the opportunity came to apply for the Finger Lakes Grape Program Area Extension Educator job, I jumped in and I got that job. And I have to say that initially I thought, I'm an entomologist. I know about bugs. I've never grown a grapevine in my life. So what is it exactly that I have to offer these people? Because they've been growing grapes for 4 or 5 generations in certain cases. But I soon found out that they weren't expecting me to be the guy that knows how to fill up a sprayer or exactly prune grapes like they could. And that might be the most wonderful extension job in New York, actually. So I did that for 9 years. I was based in Penn Yan, and then I moved back to the station, or Cornell AgriTech as we call it now, as Senior Extension Associate to start this statewide viticulture extension program. And Carlin's already mentioned some of the things I did, and I'll highlight a few more things as I go along. So this has been a great run for me. It's been so much fun being in the position I'm in. So what I wanted to address today is, well, what is it that growers do with our research? You know, what changes do they make? How do we know that they're making change? And how do funding agencies know what changes they're making? And this is important because funders are increasingly interested in metrics. You know, how do you know? And I'll go through a couple of funding models in a minute. So here's my 5 key takeaways from extension and the way I ran my extension program. So first of all, my feeling is that the on-farm research and demonstration projects are kind of the key. I always view that as my first job. I wasn't there to solve problems for people necessarily, to take calls, to tell people what to spray. So that gets to the second point, is that extension, some people think it's about being a consultant, but it's not about telling growers what to do. It's about learning. And I'll get to that in a moment again. So generating and explaining data is the thing that sets us aside from consultants and people who tell growers what to do. So that's kind of our superpower, is that we have access to data, we generate it. And this is news to funders, but change doesn't generally happen within the life of a single project. You know, it's more gradual than that. And finally, it really pays to be opportunistic. So I want to go through a couple of models. So I think our standard thing that I grew up with is that you have the researchers. They're the ones that generate the knowledge. They pass it on to extension, who disseminate the knowledge. The growers adopt the practices. And then it's kind of like a little package that you deliver to them. And so this approach really emphasizes, define the project, the problem, test hypothesis, do an experimental design, get the results. And then at the end, you get this statement, which I've seen in so many grant proposals, that results will be disseminated through winter conferences, et cetera. How many of you PIs have written that in grant proposals? Yeah, me too. And then I've been listed on many, many more grant proposals that say exactly that. So that's kind of the standard model. And a while back, we came along, probably about 20 years ago, we came along this outcome-driven project model. And that was championed with New York Farm Viability Institute, the Northeast Sarah program. And this guy, R. David Smith, who was the associate director of Cornell Cooperative Extension, is the guy behind disseminating this model and getting these organizations to adopt it. So here's how that goes. First, you start out with grower-defined barriers and opportunities. You get growers together saying, what are your problems? They set goals, they have performance targets, and then milestones and activities. And this is all pointed out to the outcomes that you want, right? So X number of growers adopt practices, save Y amount of money, or generate Z economic impact. So this is a fine model, but when I wrote these proposals, and I did several of them, I found myself in the middle of it saying, damn it, I just want to test these 3 treatments and see what happens. And this model doesn't say anything necessarily about the knowledge itself or the things that you learn. It's more about how people react to it. So where's the science? And so the model sort of goes like this. You expose 500 growers to this practice. You receive training, and then 30 growers adopt it. And then these are the things that come out of it: metrics, success stories, outcomes. Interesting, they never ask for failure stories, right? I tried something, it didn't work. So it's still the packet at the end. And here's an example. This is from a few years ago, the Farm Viability's website. And they say, well, it's not about the hours that you clock in research, fact sheets, et cetera. It's about what people do to this. So you're supposed to, again, measure these metrics, have the success stories, and then the outcomes, okay? And I have an example of that. This is a project we did 2006 to 2008. We put together this comprehensive sustainable practices workbook called Vine Balance. I did this with members of the industry, and it's really comprehensive. It covers pest management, viticulture, spray technology, et cetera, et cetera. So it covers a wide range of things. But here's sort of the bottom line, and this again is off the Farm Viability website, is that what it came down to is the only metrics we could come up with was nitrogen use. So they invested $148,000 in the project. We reported that growers reduced nitrogen applications by 40%, and here's the return on investment. Well, that's just one aspect of something where everything else, if it's about sustainability, it's a little bit harder to measure because it's about grower relations, it's about community, it's about environmental quality. So how do you put a dollar figure on that? It's harder than something I can do. So here's how I think it actually works or should work. You have growers, researchers, extension, all kind of communicating with each other. The researchers bring the disciplinary focus. Extension brings the generalist focus. And then come up with ideas, questions, trials. You know, that can be laboratory and field trials, collaborative on-farm demos, and then you have the results, but you're also communicating during the project, and then growers try something, and then they adapt it, right? And then it goes back. So really, it's definitely not a package. It's more of a process, basically. So I want to offer several examples of things where we know that growers have really changed their practices. And then I'm going to go on and talk about some field trials and sort of the impacts. So here's one that Dave Godoy did in the early 2000s. He took some powdery mildew and inoculated clusters at various times and kind of overturned the prevailing thought about how to keep your clusters clean from powdery mildew and later on downy mildew. So before he did this, people thought, well, they're susceptible the entire summer and until you reach 8 degrees Brix when they start ripening. So you got to keep things on. Well, he found that they actually became resistant much earlier. So 4 to 6 weeks after bloom, then you could be sure that if your clusters were clean, they're going to stay clean. And so this has been a cornerstone. This is stuff that Wayne Wilcox wrote. And so we really emphasize the pre-bloom to early post-bloom sprays, for the times when the grapes are most susceptible and so forth. And then after that, you can sort of ease off on the things directed at the clusters. So again, this is a cornerstone of our IPM program, is this. Another one is involved Justine Vanden Heuvel and Gavin Sachs. And it was all about leaf removal and when you should do it, right? And before they did this study, people knew that leaf removal was important, that cluster exposure was important, but they just sort of say, well, I'm going to do it when I get around to it, and sometime midsummer or something. Well, Gavin, a wine chemist, went out in the vineyard every week, collected samples, measured methoxypyrazines, and found out that cluster exposure very early in the season really had a big impact on how many of these methoxypyrazines were produced, and therefore how much of them that you ended up with at the end of the season. So, that alerted people to the fact that the early leaf removal was important, and it really changed practices. It went from I'll do it when I get around to it to, God, I better get out there and do that because it's so important. So we wrote this up in the first issue of Appalachian Cornell, this article called Cornell Researchers Tackle Green Flavors in Red Wines. Andrew Landers was here for about 15 years or so before he left, and he's back in England. But his spray trials, sprayer setup using deflectors, et cetera, et cetera. I always used to joke with him that every talk could be about improving deposition and reducing drift, because that's what he contemplated. So he had set up this patternator at one of his many demonstrations at field meetings. And then he did collaborate with Jim Myers and Justine Vanden Heuvel. We were able to quantify through this thing called the EPQA, Enhanced Point analysis, that the spray coverage, really was highly dependent on the fruit exposure. So this grower, Bill Dalrymple, took it upon himself to build one of these patternators out of window screens. And so here's an example of a grower taking something that was designed for research and applying it to their own vineyard. So he built it for what, 50 bucks. And he says in 15 minutes, I can run my sprayer and find out, how the spray is being distributed and make adjustments thereby. Okay, this is a little bit more long-term, and this is our nitrogen use guidelines. When I started, I talked to growers in '97, and they say, oh yeah, 300 pounds ammonium nitrate, 100 pounds actual nitrogen per acre, and I can't afford to skimp on this. It's cheap insurance. You hear that a lot. But Nelson Shawless in the 1960s established this experiment called the West Tier Factorial. I can't get into details about it, but found out that, no matter how much nitrogen they applied, if it was above 50 pounds, they only got a little extra vine growth and no extra yield. So, so he was able to say, 50 pounds, that's it. So, that went through Bob Poole, Terry Bates, and my predecessor, Dave Peterson, started talking about this in maybe the 1980s, early 80s. And then I carried on, and pretty soon I'd talk to growers at coffee shops. I said, well, how much are you putting on this year? Well, I backed it off to 70 pounds. And the next year, 50 pounds. And of course, many of our vinifera growers don't apply any additional nitrogen at all. So, so this is a big success, and this is what we cited in our farm viability grant. But 30 to 50% reduction in nitrogen application or excess nitrogen application. Okay, so I want to move on now to some examples of on-farm trials. And the first one is field trials that educate me, being an entomologist, not having any background in nutrition or not that much in horticulture. And then surveys to gauge how important an issue was, demonstrations that happened alongside research trials. And then sort of serendipity, how one thing turned into something else. And then I want to finish it off with a project that's had an enormous economic impact, but it's based on stuff that was started in the 60s and moved on with our Concord growers. So my first example is effective foliar and soil boron applications. And I was an entomologist. This was early on in my career. I didn't know anything about boron. So I decided to do this trial with kind of a guy who's kind of a backbencher. He doesn't really go to meetings. He doesn't. So, but he had a low boron vineyard. And so we set up a trial there and compared, soil or no soil and different rates of foliar sprays. So here's the results. And this is, like the second year or the first year of my extension. Found out that the soil and foliar application increased the yield per shoot in his vineyard, increased fruit set, but 1 pound of foliar was as good as 2.5 pounds, and 2.5 pounds often resulted in foliar injury. So this is the petiole results, and the foliar increased petiole boron more than the soil, but 2.5 pounds again was too much, and 1 was enough. And then the boron levels dropped in August when we sampled again, but not as much with the soil application. So that gave more sustained release of boron. That was important. So I put that in my newsletter, and that gave me the confidence to be able to make recommendations to growers about boron, and I think had an impact. Again, how do we measure it? Next example I want to relate has to do with vine balance, our important thing, and so this is an opportunistic thing. that was made possible because Alan Laxo retired. He had a vineyard up at the station and nobody was going to take it over, so I did. And that gave me an opportunity to do some really radical things and run that vineyard into the ground, which I did over the next several years. Okay, and this is something where, you know, I had done all the reading, but I really wanted to experience what happens when you manipulate carbon, source, and sink things. So again, you know, the source being the leaf area, the sinks for the carbohydrates that are produced, you know, go into different places, shoot tips, fruit, roots, storage, and so forth. So I decided to do this experiment to radically manipulate these things in that vineyard. And I wanted to measure how, particularly how defoliating vines affected the bud hardiness, because that's a sort of a thing, is that you want to maximize the bud hardiness, but what happens when you get downy mildew late in the season? You lose all your foliage, etc. Okay, so I'm not going to tell you everything about this, but we established 5 treatments. We had a standard one with 24 shoots. We had one where we limited it to 8 shoots. We defruited some vines, and then we defoliated, you know, 1 time and 2 times vines. Not exactly what I'd planned, but you know, here we go. The standard was supposed to be balanced cropping. You know, 8 shoots undercropped, defruited, no crop, sink limited, and then overcropped and source limited with a high fruit to foliage, or really infinite fruit to foliage ratio. So this is what we did. We defoliated vines early in July. By August, they'd grown a complete other canopy. And so we then sort of cut them off at the 10th node and let those vines continue to ripen, the fruit continue to ripen without any leaves whatsoever. So here's the results in a nutshell. So the standard is on the left. If we look at the 8 shoot, we reduced the yield by 60%, but increased the cluster weight by 40%. So, you know, the clusters were 40% bigger. Of course, there were far fewer of them, which accounts for all the yield loss. Defoliated them once at fruit set. We got really tiny berries, had the same number of clusters, but our yield went down by 60%, our cluster weight by 40%. And then, but the fruit ripened because we had another canopy there. And then when we defoliated it again, you know, we lost the yield, minus 60%, cluster weight down by 50%. And of course, these grapes didn't ripen at all. And then the buds were not as hardy. This is the only treatment we had that affected the bud hardiness negatively. And a lot of those vines died. So I ran them into the ground. Okay, so that's one of the things, those are the 2 things I did to find out, well, how far can I push things one way or another? You know, what impact do our practices have? And I could do that at the experiment station because I didn't have to worry about the crop. The 3rd example I have is a survey that we did about grapevine leaf roll. So we wanted to survey the vineyards to measure the extent and impact. And this all started out with Mark Fuchs, hi Bruce, who came and shortly after he came to Cornell, started looking at vineyards, and we found a lot of leaf roll. This is Limburger, 4 rows of Limburger with the leaf roll symptoms, and very prevalent. And I was later to find out that all the Limburger wood came from one source, and it was all infected with leaf roll in about 10 vineyards in the Finger Lakes. So we did this survey, and Mark did this, several locations, I think about 70 vineyards that we did. And we found out that it was indeed very common. 70% of our vineyards, vinifera vineyards, had at least some leaf roll, some a lot, some not so much. In our hybrid varieties, you know, about 57% of them had different leaf roll. So my part, oh, okay, excuse me. And then Mark measured the spread and found out that year over year, these mealy bugs at the top of the screen that you can see really would transmit it from vine to vine within the vineyard. So my part was to go to a vineyard where I knew there was some infected and some non-infected or non-symptomatic vines and do periodic fruit sampling. So I did this, and basically the upshot was we found out that at least in terms of bricks, it delayed ripening by about 2 weeks, which is a problem with Cabernet Franc when you harvest it in the middle of October anyhow. So essentially, the infected vines were never getting, the fruit was never getting ripe on them. So that's in the single vineyard. I then followed that up with looking at paired vines in different vineyards, 11 different vineyards, and found out, at a given time, up to 3.5 degrees Brix difference between the infected and non-infected vine. And this was after 2004 when we lost a lot of vines due to winter injury. And here's a, and they'd plant new vines and they'd be infected. So here they've lost a vine, and then a couple of years later, they find out that their replants are infected with virus and they have to go and replace them again. So, so this really convinced a lot of growers to pay attention to leaf roll. And we put this all in this article about grapevine leaf roll. And then that was followed up with, and Mark enlisted Miguel Gomez and the cooperators to do an economic analysis of leaf roll. And he went beyond what economists usually do. What economists usually do is say, well, this cost the industry X millions of dollars, but they went through and they did different management scenarios and a net present value analysis to show if you actually did different management, where you'd end up. So he came up with a figure that of probably $10,000 an acre over the 25-year life of the vineyard. Okay, here's one with another one with Justine, who again, just after she arrived, started some different trials with canopy management. And this one is about shoot thinning with Maréchal Foch. And so she did a study where she did control versus unshoot thin versus shoot thin, early harvest and late harvest, and then did some wine sensory analysis on that. And this gets to the point of, well, how much does it cost and how much is the benefit? So I went out with these guys one day and timed them as they were kind of going at slow walking speeds, doing the shoot thing. And, about 15 seconds per vine, that translates to 3 hours an acre, 50 bucks, but then they lose crop too. So they're reducing the crop whilst thinning the shoots. So that's $750 in lower receipts. So to make this pay, essentially you need to get an extra $800 an acre in quality, whether that's being able to sell your grapes or have higher priced wine as opposed to Franc, right? And then here's a timing issue. If you wait until the shoots are that long, it's going to take you 5 times as long to do. So this is Steve Lurch, Justine's technician that was a little late on a study that Justine was doing that year. Okay, so what did Justine find? Well, she found that, and this is compared to the control, where they harvested early, they didn't shoot thin. Just doing the shoot thinning increased some of the good stuff, fruit, banana, apple, rose, decreased some of the bad stuff. So that had an effect, just the shoot thinning. Just harvesting them a week later had a big effect, kind of comparable. And if you did them both together, it was kind of an additive effect. So these are interesting results. And then she measured, revenue and costs, and figured out that the grower would have to receive, $161 more a ton to actually pay for that thinning in terms of the lost yield. or 22 cents a bottle or 31 cents a bottle. So that's fine. So about a year after she did that, I decided to go out and do demo trials in 8 different vineyards, mostly hybrids. And I'm not going to go through this whole table, but 18 to 42 seconds per vine, half a ton to 3.3 tons per acre. Differences in lost yield and quality. And then we did see very consistent Brix effect. So this is one notable thing where we actually made wines out of these. So this is a block called Leon Millot down on Cuca Lake. And you can see the difference between the clusters there, unthinned on the left, thinned on the right, totally different cluster shape and set. So what happened in this? Well, we reduced the shoots per vine, clusters per vine, crop weight, tons per acre by about 30 to almost 50%, but increased the cluster weight, the berry weight, and the berries per cluster. Also increased the Brix. So came up with higher quality fruit, right? Okay, so if we look at, he was getting $800 per ton. So we figured that with the amount we thinned off in this low yielding vineyard, he'd need an extra $300 per ton or $50, 50 cents a bottle for the price. So that goes a certain way, but the problem was that this is a highly prized wine without shoot thinning. It went for $20 a bottle. And if he had a ton less fruit per acre, that translates to 831 fewer bottles of wine to sell and $16,000 lower gross receipts. So, in this case, he can sell all he wants, and the quality, the extra quality he gets probably doesn't matter. And I'm going to skip over this. This just shows we did the same thing on Cabernet, but it was a lower proportion of the yield. And really, it only made a $90 difference per ton for equal returns, or 13 cents. So highly cultivar dependent and yield dependent. So here's what the wine evaluation said for Justine's project. They liked the shoot thin wine. They found it was different than the control and they preferred it over the control, right? So that's one result. And I did with the Leon Millot, we went to the Grape Growers Convention and did side-by-side of the thinned and unthinned vines. And all the growers pretty much thought they were different. They tasted differently. So which one do you prefer? 60% said, I like the shoot thin. 40% said, I like the no shoot thin. So that's a pretty even thing. So it just underlines the point that it's really hard to relate this to dollars or willingness to pay for the wine. So, okay. Fifth example, a shoot thinning trial turned into a fruit rot trial. This was one where I was looking at the impact of shoot thinning on yield and quality of Vignoles, but it turned out, we turned this into a rot trial. So here's the VSP with shoot thinning, no shoot thinning, high Cordon with shoot thinning or no shoot thinning. And then since this was machine harvest with long spurs, there was a lot of these persistent rachises from last year, a lot of Botrytis inoculum on those. So we did a trial where we, so here's what the wines we made out of them looked like. Anyhow, so Wayne went out there and did the Botrytis ratings, and we looked at all 3 scenarios on the two training systems, and basically, the top wire Cordon that always had more Botrytis, and really was, it never got below 50% on that. But when we looked at the VSP, with none, we had a certain amount. If we removed the rachises, we got some reduction. If we shoot, then we got more reduction. If we did them both, they sort of had this additive effect. And this is what the fruit looked like, shoot thin versus non-shoot thin. And Anna Catherine Mansfield refused to make wine out of the stuff on the right. Okay, so last example here. And this is something that is sort of a totally new way of thinking about managing crop load on Concords, because Concords are a commodity crop, and high yield is, high yield and low cost. That's always been the objectives that we've been shooting for. So 2013 was a very heavy crop year, and it was interesting. I talked to Rich Ertl, the director of Cooperative Extension, grower relations at National Grape Cooperative. And that year, a lot of their growers did mechanical shoot thinning for the first time, or cluster thinning. So 50% of our New York acres, 33% of our Pennsylvania acreage mechanically thinned in July. And as a result, they were able to get 8 to 9 tons and deliver it early. If they didn't thin, they would have to wait till the end of the season, and it might not even get ripe. So this is a huge economic benefit in that 1 year, and it goes back to foundational concepts of crop load done by Nelson Shawless in the 60s. And then Bob Poole and Terry Bates followed it up with minimal pruning. Terry refined it into kind of a system, and then they did lots of demonstration. So the conservative estimate of the impact was that it was $9 million in 2013. And just a note, here's how they do it. You take your grape harvester out and you harvest 48 feet of row. That's 1/100th of an acre. You weigh the fruit. And then you go to this table to say, well, I got this much fruit. And, basically at 30 days post-bloom, it's going to be, half of what you're going to end up with at the end of the season. So then they can take their mechanical harvester out in early August and, thin it and then hasten the ripening, or avoid delaying the ripening, actually, depending on the growing season. So that's what growers did, and here's what happened. The purple bar is 2013. Left side is the ones that thin, they got less yield. The unthin, higher yield. And this is from spray record, harvest weight records. So when they thinned, they kind of evened out things. They got less in 2013, more in 2014. In the unthin, they got a lot in 2013, but then they paid for it in 2014 with much, much lower yields. So all told, averaged over several vineyards, it was worth a half a ton extra fruit to them over the 2 years. And this is a tribute to all the hard work that the Lake Erie squad has done over many, many years to refine these concepts. And it's interesting. We get a lot of press for sort of new things that we do, but less. It's harder to come up with something that is a result of years and years of sustained effort that really finally has an impact. Hard to interest the Cornell Chronicle in that stuff. Okay, so those are all my examples. And so we have a couple things, on the right side is what scientists like to do, right? On the left side is what some of our funding agencies and like to do. They like the metrics. Well, do we have metrics for everything? Well, there are times when we can do what they suggest, which is, document how many growers have done this, that, or the other. But oftentimes that's hard to do. And what are the alternatives? Well, send out a survey to growers. How much nitrogen are you using this year? How much? And I hate doing that because growers hate doing all those surveys. So more often than not, we're just reduced to saying things like, well, growers report that they're doing something as a result of our efforts. And meanwhile, I know that our extension programs have had a huge extension and research programs have had a huge impact on the industry, helped foster its growth, development, ecologic and economic sustainability. But sometimes that's just hard to put into return on investment sort of metrics. So again, this is the thing that I've tried to do throughout my career, is these collaborative trials, kind of the heart of my extension effort. And again, I believe, you know, the line between research and extension is best if it's kept really, really blurry. But I've managed to, over the course of my career, have the opportunity to work with so many great faculty members, techs, extension colleagues, and growers. So that's it. And thank you for your attention. Yeah, Marvin.
You know, we're seeing more and more wineries going and stuff like that, but the numbers you show make it seem like I don't know if I would invest my money doing that. So what do you advise people to come to you now and say, hey, I'm really interested in starting a winery?
Yeah. Well, what do I advise people who say, geez, I just want to grow grapes and have a winery? Yeah. Well, there's a lot more money in the value added part of it than there is in the grape growing. But I've had examples of people, you know, that come to mind, like a guy who came into my office in 1997 or 1998 and said, you know, I'm a pharmacist, I want to grow grapes. And mentally rolled my eyes and, you know, said, well, are you aware of this, this, and this? Often I try and talk people out of it because, you know, that's what you do. But, you know, here, 20 years later, he has a 50-acre vineyard, loves growing grapes, and made a real success out of it because he did his homework and so forth. So, so I guess telling him, do your homework. And I guess a lot of people really repeat the thing, how do you make a small fortune in the wine industry? You start out with a large fortune, that sort of thing. But then, you know, I have another one, Boundary Breaks Vineyard. Again, this is a guy that came in and said, you know, I'm a wine geek. I want to make the best Riesling in the world. And how many times have I heard that over the years? How many people have, you know, sort of tried to do that? But he's successful and now, you know, has 30 acres of grapes, has a wonderful business. He was very good at marketing, very, very intentional about it. So you can make a success of it. It's just, don't expect it to be easy, or don't expect to actually be making money until it's, you know, you're 11 years into it, if you're a winery. And that's just exactly been his experience, is that, you know, you invest a lot of money up front, and then, so finally it's starting to come back to him in the wine that he sold. I don't know if that's a good answer, but yes.
Hey, Tim. So kind of the question in with two different, you know, audiences. One is when you talk to the grape growers about a practice that might have a positive environmental impact, but not necessarily an economic one, how are you talking to them about that? And then the second part is that when you talk to the funders or work with the funding agencies, how would you like them to assess positive environmental impacts?
Yeah.
Because you were just mentioned economics and that they just want to know the
Yeah.
dollars, right?
Yeah.
But we know that there's a lot of positive, we do a lot of work and show positive environmental impacts from our work. How do we convey
Sure.
that back to the growers and to the funders?
Well, the growers are pretty easy sell and on it, actually, because, you know, a lot of them, like if you're on Long Island, they say, God, I'm spending way too much time on my sprayer. How do I get out of this? You know, and that might be new varieties, that might be something else. I don't have any, you know, pat answers about this, but it's the growers that have been pushing us to do the environmental impact because they want to publicize the fact that they use cover crops, they don't do any tillage, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, they're kind of pushing us in a way. So it's not a hard sell getting them to think about it. It's more tempting to soft pedal the parts that are, you know, maybe not so great with them. With funders, I think you just have to have a narrative that you tell them. And yeah, I don't see how we're going to have any, you know, huge hard metrics that we're going to be able to talk about with those things. I don't know.
Whatever's just saying, congratulations.
No questions.
Perspective. Congratulations. Wow, nice.
So what comes next? I mean, what are you thinking about?
What comes next for me?
Yeah, I mean, you've been poking around, but do you have some ideas that you want to pursue?
Yeah, well, one thing I'm doing right now that I just started last week is I'm going to be a vineyard inspector for their third-party sustainability program from the New York Wine and Grape Foundation. And this has been fun so far because the last 2 years with COVID, I've spent most of my time just sitting behind my computer and writing stuff and not seeing anybody. So now I get to go out and, you know, talk to people and find out what they're doing. And it's been interesting. Just in the first week, I found out, you know, some people are doing great stuff. Some people are doing terrible stuff in parts of their operation. You know, for example, I found a spray shed that had a bunch of squirrels living in it, you know, at one place. And then another one where they'd gotten 75% cost sharing from NRCS to build just a wonderful spray facility. So that's one of the things I like. I'd like to stay involved somewhat with the industry because I have a lot of friends in the industry, and that's really the best part of the job for me. So I don't know what I'm going to do, Marvin, but I'm going to do something. Yeah.
So, and Elizabeth Lamb would like to know, so what advice would you give to an emerging extension specialist or someone interested in becoming one?
Okay. My impression is make a good impression in the first 2 months. Get out and meet people because they always have a long memory. So if they have a bad encounter, that's what they're going to think about you for the rest of your career. One of the keys for me was just starting in right away with these trials, and people would see me out there in the Carhartts and, you know, out collecting stuff, and that's when I realized, okay, I might not know how to fill up a sprayer, but I know how to collect data, analyze it, write about it, and that's what they really value from us. So that's my other piece of advice is go out and collect some data, generate some knowledge yourself. And I guess in my position, I never had a problem getting faculty collaboration. I mean, I always felt for my colleagues, say in Wisconsin or something, where they were all out there by themselves, but here at Cornell, we had, you know, 10 or 11 different programs working on stuff. You know, I didn't mention it, but one of my most rewarding things the last couple of years has been working with Bruce Reich here on the Vitis Gen project. And it's, you know, and it's just great to, and important for somebody in extension, if they're not taking advantage of the expertise on campus, you know, I don't think they're doing their job.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.